For more than 40 years, the tragic death of Natalie Wood has remained one of Hollywood's most painful mysteries, a story filled with sorrow, confusion, and unanswered questions. For decades, Robert Wagner, her husband and the last person to see her alive, chose to stay mostly silent, avoiding interviews, documentaries, and long conversations about that terrible night. He always said the pain was too heavy, too personal, and too overwhelming to relive in front of the world. But now, at 95 years old, with time moving faster than ever and the weight of age pressing gently against his shoulders, Wagner has finally opened up in a way he never dared before. His words are not bold accusations or dramatic revelations. Instead, they're filled with deep emotion, regret, longing, and a kind of honesty that can only come from a man who has lived almost a century and still carries a heartbreak that never softened. As he speaks, he describes memories that feel frozen in time, memories that never faded even as decades passed and the world around him changed. He explains that he stayed silent not because he did not care, but because he cared too much. Every news report, every headline, and every rumor made him feel like the world was judging his grief, twisting it into something darker and crueler than it ever was. And now, when he finally chooses to share his truth, his voice trembles with years of bottled-up sorrow. His story is not about crime or blame. It is about love, loss, and the terrible burden of knowing that one moment, one night, changed everything forever. It is about the weight of what if, the haunting echoes of tragedy, and the heartbreaking understanding that some wounds never heal, no matter how much time passes. Wagner's emotional reflections reveal a man who has carried silence like a heavy stone, and now, when he finally begins to speak, the world listens with a mixture of curiosity, compassion, and sadness. Knowing this may be the last time he ever shares a side of the story, T.O. understand why Robert Wagner's late-in-life reflections feel so emotional. One must understand the love story he shared with Natalie Wood, a story filled with passion, beauty, conflict, mistakes, and an unshakable connection that lasted from the 1950s until the night of her death. Natalie was already famous at a young age, beloved for her talent, charm, and magnetic presence. Wagner, handsome and rising quickly in Hollywood, was the kind of man young actors admired and audiences adored. When they met, sparks formed instantly. They married early, divorced painfully, then unexpectedly found their way back to each other years later. Their relationship was far from perfect, but it was real, intense, and deeply emotional. Wagner often describes Natalie as the light of his life, a woman who carried herself with grace even when cameras were not watching, a woman who laughed loudly, loved fiercely, and trusted deeply. Their love was the kind that pulled them together again and again, even when arguments, jealousy, or Hollywood pressures tried to tear them apart. Wagner says that Natalie understood him better than anyone ever had, but she also challenged him, questioned him, and demanded emotional honesty in ways he sometimes struggled to give. Their home was filled with warm moments, late-night talks, quiet dinners, shared jokes, and gentle affection, but also with heated discussions, misunderstandings, and emotional storms. Still, whenever people who knew them closely talk about their relationship, they describe a bond that was intense, but never empty, complicated, but never weak. When Wagner reflects today, he does so with a pained understanding that love can be both beautiful and fragile, powerful and breakable. He says that when he looks back now, he realizes how much he took for granted. The quiet moments, the little smiles, the whispered promises. He speaks as a man who lost not just a wife, but a piece of himself, a piece he never fully recovered. And when he discusses their relationship, his voice carries the weight of someone who wishes he could relive even their most difficult days just to feel close to her again. Their love story is not just a Hollywood romance. It is a story of two souls whose connection never fully faded, even after tragedy struck. The night of November 29, 1981, remains one of the most examined and debated evenings in Hollywood history, an evening that was meant to be peaceful but instead became a haunting tragedy that reshaped countless lives. Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, and actor Christopher Walken were aboard the yacht Splendor, anchored near Catalina Island. What happened during the final hours of that night has been questioned for decades, but Wagner's recent reflections focus not on investigation details, but on the emotions and chaos he still relives in his mind. He explains that the atmosphere on the yacht was complex. There was laughter, conversation, tension, and the kind of shifting energy that can happen when close friends share drinks and strong personalities mix. Wagner now describes his memory of that night as if it were wrapped in fog, not because he cannot remember, but because he remembers too much. Every detail is colored by shock and grief. He recalls Natalie going below deck, the quiet sound of the waves against the boat, the soft glow of lights, and the strange stillness that followed. When he realized she was gone, fear gripped him like nothing he had ever felt. He searched, called her name, shouted into the dark, hoping she would answer. But the ocean remained silent. Even now, he says a memory of that silence follows him everywhere. Over the years, investigators, journalists, and the public asked endless questions, but Wagner says that his heart remembers the night in a very different way. Through the overwhelming horror of discovering the woman he loved was missing, through the helplessness of calling for help, and through the devastating moment when he learned her body had been found. He does not try to rewrite facts or create new explanations. Instead, he describes the emotional storm that swallowed him. He says that grief does not happen in a straight line. It hits in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, always unexpected. The night Natalie died is a night Wagner says he wishes he could rewrite, redo, or erase. He carries the pain of knowing that she felt alone in her final moments, and that pain is something time never softened. He says he has replayed that night in his mind thousands of times, searching for anything he could have done differently, anything that could have changed the outcome. But every time, he ends at the same heartbreaking truth. She is gone and nothing will bring her back. His reflection on that night is not a confession of wrongdoing, but a confession of lifelong sorrow, regret, and emotional devastation. After Natalie's death, the world did not grant Wagner the quiet space needed for healing. Instead, media attention intensified. Investigators revisited the case multiple times, and countless theories, both reasonable and wild, circulated for decades. Every rumor became a headline. Every headline became a wound, and every wound reopened the grief he already struggled to carry. Wagner explains that he stayed silent not because he was hiding something, but because the noise around him felt unbearable. Every interview became a trap. Every question carried an edge, and every reporter wanted drama instead of truth. He says that fame becomes a cruel burden when tragedy strikes. People believe they have a right to judge, to speculate, to accuse, forgetting that the person at the center of the storm is a human being drowning in heartbreak. Wagner says that the hardest part was knowing that people who had never met him, never met Natalie, and knew nothing about their relationship felt comfortable creating narratives that painted him as a villain. When the case was reopened years later, the pain returned with new force. Wagner cooperated, but he also felt the emotional weight crush him again. The world wanted answers, but he had no new answers to give. Only the same truth soaked in grief. Today, at 95, he says that the rumors hurt more than the official investigations because rumors steal your peace, your dignity, and your memories. They turn your private sorrow into public entertainment. Yet, even through all the suspicion and whispers, he insists that his love for Natalie never changed. He says he misses her every day, still speaks to her photo, and sometimes dreams of her smile. His late-life reflections reveal a man who has lived not only with grief, but with the painful knowledge that the world never allowed him to grieve quietly. And now, after so many years, he finally admits that the emotional weight nearly broke him, but love, memories, and time kept him standing. When asked why he chose to break his silence now, after 4 long decades, Robert Wagner says the answer is simple: time. At 95, life feels different. Every day feels shorter. Every memory feels more precious, and every regret feels heavier. He says he realized that if he did not speak now, he might never get another chance, not to defend himself, but to share his heart. He wanted people to understand the human side of the story, not the headlines, not the rumors, not the cold reports. He wanted people to know that he lost the love of his life, not a celebrity, not a co-star, but the woman who filled his home with laughter, who trusted him with her fears, who held his hand in moments of joy and sadness. He says that silence protected him for many years, but eventually, silence became a prison. As he grew older, the memories became louder, the emotions deeper, and the need for peace more urgent. Breaking his silence was not about rewriting history. It was about finding emotional closure before his time runs out. Wagner says he is not afraid of death, but he is afraid of leaving this world without expressing the truth inside his heart. He wants people to remember Natalie for her talent, beauty, and kindness, not for a tragedy, not for a mystery, not for speculation that followed her death. And he wants the world to understand that he loved her deeply, and losing her remains the greatest heartbreak of his life. His voice shakes when he says he hopes Natalie knows how much she meant to him, even now, even after all these years, even after a lifetime of sorrow. Speaking out at 95 is not an attempt to change public opinion. It is an act of love, a final tribute, and a man's attempt to find peace before life gently carries him away. As Robert Wagner reflects on his long life, one thing becomes painfully clear. Time may soften many memories, but it never softened the memory of Natalie Wood. Even after 4 decades, he says her presence still fills his home, his thoughts, and his quietest moments. He remembers the sound of her laughter echoing through their house, the way she used to walk across the room with grace that felt almost unreal, and the way she always balanced strength with gentleness. These memories do not fade with age. Instead, they grow stronger, clearer, almost sharper. Wagner explains that as the years passed, he realized that grief isn't something you get over. It becomes a part of your story, woven into your days, your habits, your silence. At 95, he feels these memories as deeply as he felt them in the early years after her death. Sometimes he still sets a place for her at the dinner table, without thinking. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night, believing for a moment that she's beside him before reality brings a familiar ache back to his chest. He says that the world sees fame, glamour, and headlines, but behind all that, there was a real marriage filled with small, intimate moments that meant more than any movie premiere. He remembers the nights they spent talking until sunrise, the quiet drives along the coast, the simple warmth of holding her hand. These are the memories he carries, not the controversy, not the rumors. And as he speaks now, it becomes clear that he is a man who has lived a long life, but never escaped the shadow of one heartbreaking night. His memories of Natalie are not just stories from the past. They are a part of him, guiding him, grounding him, and sometimes hurting him. But he says he would rather feel that pain forever than forget even one detail about her. Wagner admits that one of the deepest wounds he carries is the feeling of being misunderstood for so many years. When Natalie died, he not only lost his wife, he also lost the ability to grieve freely. The world watched him with suspicious eyes, questioning every expression, every statement, every detail that night. Instead of compassion, he says he often felt judgment. Instead of empathy, he saw speculation. Instead of support, he heard whispers. Wagner explains that the public sometimes believes celebrities are not real people, that they do not feel pain the way ordinary people do. But he felt everything, and he felt it deeply. He remembers reading cruel comments in newspapers, hearing strangers question his character, and watching documentaries that painted him as a man with secrets, even though he insisted that he had nothing to hide. The weight of public judgment, he says, was almost unbearable. It made him withdraw, made him stay silent, and made him afraid to share his heart. Every time he tried to speak, someone twisted his words. Every time he wanted to defend himself, someone accused him of lying. He says the hardest part was knowing that even people who never met him judged him as if they knew the full story. Wagner explains that grief already feels like a heavy stone pressing on your chest, but public judgment turns that stone into a mountain. Even close friends sometimes didn't know how to talk to him, unsure if mentioning Natalie would comfort him or cause pain. Over time, he learned to carry the burden alone, letting the world think what it wanted while he silently tried to survive the emotional storm inside him. Now, in his old age, he says he has accepted that some people will never change their opinion, but he hopes that by speaking now, honestly, emotionally, without anger, the world will finally understand that he is not the villain many believe him to be. He is simply a man who loved his wife deeply and suffered a loss that has followed him like a shadow for most of his life. After Natalie's death, life for Wagner did not simply continue. It changed shape completely. He describes the early days of grief as a fog he could not escape. Every room in their home reminded him of her. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her perfume lingered in the air. Her personal items sat untouched on the dresser. He says he sometimes wandered around the house at night without knowing why, simply trying to feel close to her again. Friends visited, offered support, and tried to help him through the darkness. But loneliness is a strange companion. It stays even when others are near. Wagner says he felt like he was living on autopilot. He attended memorial services, spoke to investigators, signed documents, and made decisions, but he felt detached from everything. His heart was somewhere else, back in the past, back with her. He remembers waking up each morning expecting her voice to call out from another room, only to face silence again. Over time, he learned to live with the emptiness, but he never fully filled it. He remarried later in life and found companionship, comfort, and support, but he admits that the space Natalie left inside him never closed. He says grief can exist alongside happiness. It becomes a silent companion that never leaves. Today, at 95, he reflects on those early days with a mixture of sadness and strength. He survived because he had to, but part of him stayed frozen in 1981, still standing on that shoreline waiting for news that would change everything. Loneliness, he says, is not just being alone. It is losing the person who knew you best, the person who understood your soul. And Natalie was that person. Even now, after all these years, he sometimes sits quietly with her photographs, talking to her as if she can hear him. He says these conversations give him comfort, reminding him that love does not disappear. Even when the person you love is gone, one of the most painful parts of Natalie Wood's death is a mystery that surrounds it. A mystery Wagner says he still cannot fully understand or accept. Even after decades of repeating the events of that night in his mind, he admits that some details will forever remain unclear. He explains that the human mind works strangely during trauma. Memories become distorted by shock, fear, and grief. People want definitive answers, but sometimes life does not give them. Wagner says he has spent years wondering if he missed a sound, a sign, or a moment that could have changed everything. He wonders if he should have checked on her sooner, called out louder, or reacted differently. These thoughts, he says, haunt him like a repeating echo. The world often looks for someone to blame when tragedy strikes, because blame gives people a sense of order, a feeling that everything makes sense. But Wagner insists that sometimes tragedy happens without a clear villain, without an easy explanation, without a simple ending. He believes that Natalie's death is one of those tragedies. He says that he has accepted that the mystery surrounding that night will never be fully solved, no matter how many documentaries or investigations appear. But accepting the mystery does not erase the pain. It simply becomes another part of the sorrow he carries. When asked whether he feels angry about the years of speculation, he says that anger no longer has a place in his life. At 95, he feels only sadness and a desire for peace. He wishes the world would remember that behind the mystery, there was a real woman, a real marriage, and a real love story. He hopes that people understand that the unanswered questions have not only tormented fans and investigators, they have tormented him as well. And in his quiet voice, filled with age and remembrance, he says something deeply heartbreaking. I would give anything, to turn back time. But all I can do now is remember her, love her, and live with the questions that time never answered. As Robert Wagner reaches the final chapters of his long life, he says he feels a pull toward honesty, clarity, and emotional truth. When he looks back, he sees a life filled with success, failure, joy, sorrow, hope, and regret. But above all, he sees Natalie, her smile, her voice, her presence shaping every season of his life. When asked what message he wants to leave behind, he pauses for a long moment, gathering thoughts shaped by 40 years of heartbreak. He says he wants people to understand that love does not end with death. It continues in memories, in dreams, in the quiet corners of the heart. He wants people to know that he never stopped loving Natalie, not even for a moment. He wants people to know that despite the rumors and accusations, his soul has always been full of grief, not guilt. His voice becomes emotional as he explains that speaking now is his final way of honoring her, not by revealing secrets, but by sharing the truth of his heart. He says he hopes that when people remember Natalie Wood, they remember her laughter, not the tragedy, her films, not the mystery, her kindness, not the questions. And then, in a moment filled with quiet sincerity, he shares his message to Natalie. He says he wishes she knew how often he thinks of her, how much he misses her, how deeply he regrets every moment they lost. He says he hopes she found peace somewhere beyond this world, a peace he has been searching for ever since she left. And as he speaks these words, it becomes clear that Wagner's story is not just about a famous tragedy. It is about a man who loved deeply, lost painfully, and spent the rest of his life trying to live with a wound that never healed. His final hope is simple: that the world remembers their love more than their tragedy, and that someday, perhaps beyond time, he will see her again. For over 4 decades, Robert Wagner's silence has loomed over Hollywood like a shadow, shaping the narrative of Natalie Wood's tragic death in ways both subtle and profound. Silence, in this context, was more than the absence of words. It was a deliberate, almost performative shield, one that protected a man's reputation, while leaving countless questions unanswered. When Natalie Wood disappeared that cold November night of 1981, the world was shocked, but no one anticipated the decades of silence that would follow. Wagner, a leading man with decades of experience navigating fame and scrutiny, understood the power of withholding the truth. His quietness created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, rumors, speculation, and suspicion grew unchecked. Family members, fans, and investigators were left to navigate a labyrinth of partial truths, half-statements, and controlled narratives. For Natalie's family, especially her sister Lana Wood and her children, the silence was unbearable. Each anniversary of her death reopened emotional wounds, forcing them to live under persistent weight of uncertainty. Every public appearance of Wagner, every carefully worded interview, seemed like a test of endurance, a reminder that the person who might have held answers chose not to speak. Silence, in this sense, was not passive. It was an active participant in the tragedy, prolonging grief, obstructing justice, and embedding itself into the cultural memory of Hollywood. By keeping his lips sealed, Wagner transformed a private family tragedy into a decades-long public obsession, one in which the burden of interpretation fell on everyone else. The psychological cost of this silence was immense, not only for Natalie's loved ones, but arguably for Wagner himself. Reports suggest that in the years following the tragedy, he carried guilt alongside his public persona, balancing grief and denial with the demands of an unforgiving industry. The silence became a prison of its own making, one that allowed him to survive in Hollywood, while slowly eroding the moral and emotional structure of his life. And yet, the world watched, speculated, and whispered. Silence, as it turns out, is rarely empty. It is filled with the weight of unspoken truths, shadows of memory, and the persistent echo of questions that demand answers. Wagner's eventual confession, decades later, did not simply provide answers. It shattered illusions, opened old wounds, and reminded the world that silence can be as powerful and destructive as any action. Hollywood has long been synonymous with glamour, elegance, and the creation of dreamlike narratives that blur reality and fiction. In the golden age of cinema, stars like Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner were not just actors. They were icons, embodiment of an ideal that audiences longed to believe in. Their marriage was marketed as a fairy tale, the perfect union of beauty, charm, and sophistication. On the surface, Natalie was a radiant starlet whose career had blossomed from a child prodigy to an Oscar-nominated actress, while Wagner exuded the effortless charm of a leading man whose career spanned decades. Together, they were the poster couple for Hollywood's golden image. But behind the carefully constructed facades, reality was often messier than the public could imagine. The studios and publicists of the era invested heavily in preserving these illusions, often to the detriment of truth. Scandals were hushed, whispers silenced, and personal conflicts masked to ensure that the world only saw what the industry wanted them to see. Wagner and Wood's marriage, while celebrated for its glamour, contained its own private turbulence, a tension amplified by fame, jealousy, and the pressures of maintaining a perfect public image. This duality, public adoration versus private struggle, was emblematic of Hollywood itself, a world where appearances often outweighed reality. Fans saw dazzling smiles on a red carpet and assumed harmony. They watched films that projected charm and confidence, never imagined the undercurrents of fear, tension, and eventual tragedy. When Natalie Wood disappeared that night off Catalina Island, it was a stark reminder of how fragile these illusions truly were. The public shock was magnified because the narrative they had been fed for years, that perfection of a flawless union, suddenly collided with a harsh reality of mortality, vulnerability, and human conflict. Hollywood, in protecting its stars, often prioritized image over honesty, creating environments in which secrets could fester and truths could be hidden for decades. Wagner's silence was not merely personal. It was facilitated and amplified by a system designed to maintain illusions. The interplay between celebrity, secrecy, and public perception highlights a central tension in Hollywood: the difference between life as it is and life as it is presented to the world. Natalie Wood's death forced a confrontation with that tension, exposing not only the flaws in a glamorous marriage, but also the broader mechanisms by which Hollywood cultivates and protects its own mythology, often at the expense of truth, justice, and human dignity.